At our final presentation in this stream, we have Mr. John Al-Khatib, who's joining us to present Towards Practical and Innovative Governance in Complex Projects, Integrating Paradoxes, Complexity and Contingency Perspectives. And John is a project and strategic management consultant, university lecturer and trainer with over 20 years' experience. His expertise includes large-scale project management, industrial engineering and digital transformation. With over a decade in training and coaching, he's worked with accredited providers and universities delivering management and technical programs. He has contributed to project management best practices, including reviewing PMI's body of knowledge and leading organisations to achieve PMI authorised training partner status. Please join me in welcoming John to the microphone for his presentation. Thank you, John.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for making the time today and choosing to attend my presentation. My name is John Khatib, and I'll be talking about trying at least within the next 30 to 40 minutes to summarise a year and a half of work in the domain of complex project governance. First of all, I truly hope that I look better in person than this photo. That's something I always wish. Thanks for the introduction. As I said, I've been in this space for quite some time. Barely did anything outside project management, and I'm always fascinated by this beautiful discipline. I think I'm one of the lucky people around there who does what really passionate about. Quickly about myself, so I'm doing my PhD in complex project governance with focus on large-scale projects, and my PhD is probably going to the defense sector because of the intensity and the scale and the size and the critical importance of those projects. Before I did my PhD, I did 2 masters in project management and strategic planning, just to understand projects better. I've been involved with PMI for the last 12 years, working as a practitioner and a certification holder and a reviewer of their certifications, among many other credentials. When it comes to membership, I'm very proud of being a member of a broad range of international and local institutions, including IDCGM, the International Centre for Complex Project Management, and the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge my partners in crime, my 2 supervisors, Dr. Richa Gulati and Associate Professor Indra Gunawan, who've been providing a lot of support for this work, for this body of work, and also for Mr. Colin Smith and ICCPM in general for featuring this research on their website and supporting it with all the possible means. So let's start by the motivation for this research. Why did we do this research in the first place? So in March 2025, just recently, the UK government has issued a report called Lessons Learned, Governance and Decision-Making in Mega Projects. In principle, the purpose of that report was to highlight the major difficulties and problems and issues in UK largest projects valued at £834 billion, which is a massive amount of money. According to that report, mega projects were classified or categorized by certain criteria, including high strategic importance, extreme complexity, cross-government impact, novelty, dependency on multiple stakeholder systems, among many others. And in that report, the key findings were standard governance often fails. And we probably, if you've been in governance on complex projects, you realize this outcome way before March 2025. The reason behind this is because standard governance or traditional governance is static. It's not project sensitive and it's not dynamic. The other factors, the other key findings that this report highlighted include lack of clarity, early clarity, which means projects are going through the pipeline, through the stage gates without proper review and approval and assessment, especially at the initiation phases. So some projects are assessed to be complex, but not as complex as it should or it was. Plus cultural and leadership gap, and Colin spoke a few minutes ago about the role of leadership in complex realities. So the recommendations out from the report were to categorize mega projects, clearly have a systematic way to understand what sort of mega projects we're dealing with. So clear criteria that treat them differently from major projects. But what does differently means? Adopt governance models. And this, in other words, make governance model more sensitive to that classification or categorization. Clarify roles and decision rights. And this is a major issue in complex projects. Who does what? And do they have the authority to make that decisions? So it's one thing to create that RACI matrix, completely other thing to implement that RACI matrix. Strengthen gateways, just to make sure that projects are not going through the pipeline without proper assessment and understanding of its underlying complexity and challenges. And finally, use scenario testing and assurance. So governance should adapt to external shocks and long-term uncertainty. In other words, it shouldn't be static. But the thing is, this report doesn't actually highlight an actual steps to implement those recommendations. Now, luckily, we started this research a year before that report. So we spotted that gap and the need for adaptive, responsive, sensitive governance models. In February, so we started this research in February, a year before that report. So from our perspective, we looked at the sources of complexity in our projects. We looked at PMI model for assessing complexity, which is, from my personal opinion, is very primitive. You look at complexity from 3 dimensions: ambiguity, system behavior, and human behavior. Now, of course, you can break it down into multiple subcategories, but it's still very primitive. You look at the literature, you look at the research on the other side of the slide, you see a broad range of reasons and sources for project complexity, including knowledge complexity. So what is complex to some organizations is less complex to others, and vice versa. You look at stakeholders, legal scope, size, technology, innovation, life cycle, length of the life cycle. You look at structural, technical, human behavior, descriptive and perceived complexity. So there is actually no clear definition of complexity in the literature that can help us subjectively understand what is, systematically understand what's the underlying complexity. We also look at governance in complex projects in the literature, and we found fragmentation in definition of governance. We've seen some authors and academics defining governance as an extension of corporate governance. So it's just basically whatever we have in the organization, let's extend it to the project. We found it too rigid for dynamic environments. We found it conceptual and supplemented by qualitative data, the research about governance. So eventually we found that fragmentation in the definition of role of governance in complex environment really established in the literature. And then we highlighted the connection between complex projects and complex systems. So if you are in the system domain, you will probably know that there is some important works in the system domain about complex system governance. But in comparison, there is minimal work in complex project governance. So we looked at the comparison, we looked at the similarities between complex projects and complex systems. And we found a lot of similarities between complex systems and complex projects. And this similarity and this literature is roughly around 12 years old. Talking about interdependencies, connectivity, emergence, uncertainty, nonlinearity, feedback loops, adaptation, self-organizing, etc. So there is a lot of synergy and similarity between the characteristics of complex projects and the characteristics of complex systems. So why not use the theories in complex systems to solve the problem? And this was our approach. So even though this is a PhD, that doesn't mean it's a PhD. It doesn't mean it's the intention behind this PhD is to redigest the literature. It's more about creating some sort of solution. And our approach to create that solution followed the following steps. Step number 1 was systematic literature review. We looked at the literature, we looked at the case studies, we looked at organizations. What did they do to address complexity from a governance perspective? How did they manage the underlying problems and challenges in that domain? So we looked at innovative governance models and frameworks. And the word innovative is driven from novelty, from sensitivity, from context-based structure, adaptability, learning, systematic alignment and strategic objective, etc. So we looked at the literature. See, we looked at how did organization manage those challenges. So we identified the challenges, the complex project characteristics. We looked at the challenges enforced by those characteristics. And based on those characteristics and challenges, we managed to highlight 4 governance models or generic models. Those models were analyzed using 3 theories: contingency theory, paradox theory, and complexity theory. And I'll explain a little bit about them in a second. The 4 models or themes that we found in the literature and the case studies that we studied are presented on the screen. So first one is the adaptive and flexible governance. And that governance model is basically very sensitive to the changes in the environment. When we looked from a paradoxes perspective, from using the paradox theory, we found that organizations who adopted that theme were struggling, were in the tension between structure and flexibility, short-term, long-term, accountability, and trust. In other words, on a daily basis, on a periodic basis, the organization had to make decisions between should I give more control or should I give more flexibility? Should I focus on the short term or should I focus on the long term? And that created that adaptive and flexible governance. If you look at the knowledge and learning governance, which is the third one, we found organizations navigating between explicit and intuition knowledge, documented knowledge or knowledge embedded in our head. So, and that connects to innovation. So if you're managing an innovative project or a new technology, you want to rely on people's innovation and people sharing information, that creation and utilization, or sharing and protection. In highly protective and sensitive environments, we found organizations leaning towards protection more than sharing, even though the project needs more sharing. So the 4 models that we had was adaptive and flexible governance, hybrid and multi-layer governance, so within the same organization, and knowledge learning governance, as I mentioned, and structured and integrated governance. This is when you have multiple organizations, especially in the public-private domain, working together. And the paradoxes that you see on the side, on the second column, are the essence of those models. So now, what to do with this? We said, let's map that tension. Let's look at those forces and highlight and understand the profile of those of that paradoxes. So what's going on? If you look at the right radar map, you can see that profile of tension leans towards the structure at the top and leads towards sorry, I need to have a look here. And leads toward intuition or intuitive or sharing knowledge. And that can be problematic sometimes because structure doesn't actually facilitate sharing knowledge to the extent that the complex project requires. So basically what we managed to get out of this mapping is not only the profile, the tension profile of the project, but if there is any paradoxes within the paradoxes themselves. So if there is any conflict that within those paradoxes themselves. You can see that we solved that tension or that problem in the second profile. So you can see that this organization or that complex project would require structure, so leaning towards structure at the top, but at the same time, it leaning toward explicitity or explicit knowledge, documented knowledge within the organization. And that makes sense from a practical point of view. So this map also helped us not only in understanding the underlying tension, but if there is any conflict within that tension. So all of this work have led us to design a model. And our model promote 2 things. Number one is to systematically analyze and understand the tension in the complex project. What is the tension, the underlying tension within the project? Is it structure? Is it flexibility? Is it trust? Is it short-term, long-term? What is the tension in the project and how it's changing? And then systematically assess the complexity of that project. And if you attended Colin's presentation, you can see that the complexity assessment designed by IDCGM fits perfectly in that layer. So that layer, when assessing complexity and assessing tension and actually connecting those two elements together, you have a dynamic relationship between the environment, the circumstances, the tension, and the complexity assessment of the project. And that is what is not included within the recommendation of the project, of the UK government report. So the complexity diagnostic layer will look at identifying, categorizing project-specific complexity factors, and that can vary widely depending on the complexity tool that you can use, where the governance tension diagnostic layer will tell you exactly what's the profile, what's the tension profile within the project, and if there is anything, any embedded paradoxes within the paradoxes themselves. Together, when you understand the tension and understand the complexity, we can work on that strategic layer to design a governance model. And of course, using that system thinking, we should have a continuous improvement and a feedback loop that can help us evolve in our practice. So let's put this into practice. Can this model be applied? Of course. So for the purpose of this presentation, we've chosen something interesting. We've chosen a case study from community service, mental health space, and we applied a complexity assessment from defense. So in other words, we assessed a community service project using a complexity assessment from defense, and to see how this model will work in real life. So if you're familiar with the mental health services in South Australia, where I come from, the Mental Health Services 2020-2025 is an overarching plan to organize and lead the mental health services across the state. It's led by the Office of Chief Psychiatrist, and if you want to put it into perspective, that CAT2 analysis will help you. Who are the actors, who are the service providers, what's the expected outcomes, etc. So when we want to assess the tension, we want to look at the tension from practical perspective in this case study. We look at things like structure versus flexibility. So let's say we are in the beginning of the project. Which one of those two are more important? Of course, structure. You need structure at the beginning to establish the project, to set up the governance structure, to set up the relationship, etc. So when you map the tension, when you evaluate that tension or that paradox, you realize that structure, that the project is leaning towards structure. Now, on the other side, if you look at the knowledge and assess the tension between sharing versus protection, you realize that it's leaning towards sharing, because in community service, it's all about us working together. It's all about helping to solve a very complex social problem. So this step represents our tension diagnostic layer in the model. Now we understand what are the tension, what are the forces that are competing within the project, and if there is anything that contradicts or if there is any paradoxes within the paradoxes. Our next step is to assess complexity. So we looked at the Enterprise Engineering Profiler, which is an ancient complexity assessment tool used in defense in the United States. It assesses complexity from 4 dimensions, and it actually fits very perfectly within the environmental factors assessment domain from the complexity assessment tool from IDCGM. So it assesses complexity from implementation context, from a stakeholder context, from a strategic context, and from a system context. So we did our assessment for the mental health services plan. We looked at things like stakeholder, for example. We looked at stakeholder context, for example. And we've seen that there is a certain element within that stakeholder that will promote complexity or enforce complexity. We looked at the mission of the system, and we've seen that the mission will evolve because we're dealing with a very complex social problem. So we compared that complexity to the tension, and we managed to connect both of them together. This can be done very easily and systematically using any assessment tool. So when you connect both of them together, you realize that the system behavior will respond to things like structure. The stakeholder behavior will respond to something like creation and utilization. So for example, Structure versus flexibility. If we want to look at this tension between structure and flexibility, so we might start with a structure to comply with health policy, funding rules, and risk control. But down the track, while executing the project, you might need more towards flexibility, because the network now that you see of the service providers over there, the network now is more engaged in the project. They know each other. They've established some relationships. So now governance need to adopt. If you keep enforcing structure throughout the project lifecycle, that will compromise the network nature of that system. If you look at same as centralization versus decentralization, so initially you might have a centralized control through SA Health, and then a delegation of authority through that governance channel and a feedback loop back to SA Health. But with time, you might need to integrate intuitive knowledge into governance. Have a look at rise of community-driven innovation or a crisis response like suicide cluster, like the Ukrainian refugee influx of refugees recently. That will all enforce changes to the tension within the project, which means it needs to respond, and that change needs to be reflected on the governance structure applied. Short-term versus long-term. Pressure on short-term outcomes due to political cycles, crisis indicators, etc. You might have urgency. But if any emergence within the system, like long-term reduction in suicide rates, we might shift towards long-term system planning. So when you go back to the model, that connection between that tension layer and complexity layer can actually make that system dynamic and responsive based on changes in the environment. And we also found a lot of misrepresentation or lack of investigation within that governance tension diagnostic. We found a lot of case studies looking at tension within projects from a specific angle, not from a holistic point of view like we did here. But what are the limitations that we have? If you recall at the beginning of my presentation, I talked about complex project characteristics and their connection to the problem and challenges enforced in the project. Our research was very limited by the sector because most of the data that we found in the literature were related to engineering projects, infrastructure projects, defense projects, public-private partnership. We also had a lot of subjectivity involved in our assessment. So from our perspective, those tensions and paradoxes that we've identified were based on our consultation. So you might come up with a different definition for the tension, but the principle is there. We want to represent the challenges in the complex projects as a tension, as a force that drags the project and the organization between two opposing forces. It is simplified to some extent, but with the introduction of more comprehensive assessment tools, we can actually put this model into practice, hopefully. So what we recommend, among the many recommendations that we have, we look at advanced complexity assessment tools, as I mentioned, and the one that's going to come soon from IDCGM is extremely important in bridging a huge gap in assessing complexity from a systematic point of view. We're looking now at validating that model by interviewing and looking at partnership with organizations and trying to see how this model can be applied in a real case scenario rather than theoretical. We know for sure that there are other paradoxes and tensions within the project, but we didn't pick them up because we did the systematic literature review. We were limited by the literature. But if you ask yourself today, how many competing forces within the project and what are the possible tensions in any project, you're probably going to identify many other tensions. So we're limited by the one that we found in the literature. And finally, our research was based on a paradox theory. So we wanted to look at the challenges from that point of view, but other research might look at the challenges of a project from a completely different angle. So now we are in this phase, in the qualitative phase, where we're interviewing professionals and trying to get some idea about their views about this model. So some of the things that we heard from professionals about the model and about their experience is how much governance is enough. Too much governance becomes a burden. Why the governance are not changing, why the project circumstances are changing. Complexity assessment is done subjectively and it's done very quickly at the beginning of the project. And we're not revisiting that complexity assessment down the track. We heard many things about leadership roles and changes in those leadership roles. So that static leadership assignment or role assignment at the beginning of the project might not be relevant down the track or midway through the project. We heard many observations about clarity or lack of clarity in the role, and that all fits within our model at some point. So if you are interested in knowing more about this research, I tried to be as concise as I could within this limited time. Please feel free to hang out. I'll be more than happy to explain further about this model and how we reached these findings and what are our future plans. This is my personal website, and that's my personal email, plus my email at the University of Adelaide. And also, if you are involved in governance of complex project and you would like to participate in the research, I'll be more than happy to organize an interview, and I'll be thankful, actually, if you want to share your insights and thoughts about this research. Appreciate it, and thank you so much for your time.